Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's learning session, Learning and Sharing to Improve Program Outcomes, a how-to guide organized by WWF Forest and Climate. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. My name is Emmeline Gasparini, and I am a program associate with the Forest and Climate team. Our presenter today is Maria Fernanda Jaramillo. She's the Knowledge Sharing and Learning Manager of WWF Forest and Climate, and she also shares some of her time with WWF Colombia. Next slide, please. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics and some frequently asked questions. For those of you who have participated in past sessions, this will sound familiar, but yes, today's presentation is being recorded, and you can find the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. To get to the recording, simply go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate. There are two audio options. You can listen through your computer or dial in through the phone number that was provided in your registration email. It's important to note that if you experience audio difficulties while listening through your computer, those are sometimes caused by having too many browser windows or programs open at once. So feel free to close some of them, which usually solves the issue, or you're always welcome to join by phone. And if you continue to have technical difficulties, please send me a message via the questions or the chat area, and I'll try to get you sorted out. On those lines, questions are absolutely welcome. In fact, the last 20 minutes of this webinar is reserved for your questions, so please feel free to send them in anytime during the webinar using the toolbar on your screen, and we'll answer as many as possible during our allotted time. After the webinar, you'll receive a link in your follow-up email with additional forest and climate resources, both from WWF and from other organizations, including a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch a recording of the session. So thank you again so much for joining us, and with that, we'll get started. Next slide, please. All right, Maria Fernanda, why don't you take us away?
Hello, everybody. We are very pleased to share with you some of our developments on learning. We are going to give you a quick overview on 4 of the aspects of a learning process. We are going to see what is and what is not a learning process, the importance of learning to improve our organizational culture, and we are going to guide you through our 4-step route and some of the tools we use on our learning processes. And at the end, we are going to share a couple of lessons learned from learning. Next, please. First of all, we would like to clarify what is not a learning process. It's not an evaluation, because we consider we don't have to emit any judgment about the experience we are analyzing. Every experience we implement is rich in aspects. It covers a lot of different issues: administrative things, technical, political, sociocultural. With a learning process, we don't seek to explain all of that aspects of an experience. It is not the description of an experience. We are not only talking about what we did or what we are doing and the way we are doing it. It is not just organizing or documenting a process, organizing information or documenting events or the process that we are implementing. Next, please. But it is important to consider that even though a learning process is not an evaluation is a rich source of learning, and a learning process could give lots of inputs to evaluate an experience. So we promote to strengthen the links between evaluation and learning. We don't have to explain all the aspects of an experience, so we have to focus on very specific aspects of that experience. During the next slides, we are going to see how we do this focalization. Even though it is not a description of the experience, we need to describe what has been done and how it has been done in order to implement our learning process. And considering that it's not just organizing information or documenting a process, is very important, is key to have access, timely access to the documents that the experience already have produced and organize that information in a way that help us for the learning process. Next, please. How are we going to understand the learning process? Next. First of all, we are going to understand it as a methodological process. It means it's a premeditated process, and it is organized under a particular design that we have put in place to respond to some expected objectives and results. Next. That methodological process should facilitate organizing the memories and the data. This means this has to do with the documentation that has been already produced and will be produced within the frame of that experience that we are analyzing. When we are talking about memories and data, we are talking about videos, photos, written documents, but also, and perhaps the main thing under this approach to learning, we are talking about what people that have been participating in this experience considers significant, and we are very interested in their memories and their perceptions. Next. That methodological process should also guide the exercise of reflection and analysis. That is one of the core things under this approach to learning. It's not merely, as we were saying, it's not merely the description of what has been done, but with the learning process, we have the opportunity to go deeper, to analyze and reflect on some aspects of the experience. Next. The final aim of this kind or this approach to learning is to collect lessons and recommendations. Those lessons and recommendations could be used for the same team that is conducting or interested in the learning process, or could be used for other teams and group of stakeholders. Next, please. And as we were saying before, those memories and data, reflections and analysis, lessons learned, and recommendations should be focused on a particular topic of interest for a group of actors. That group of actors could be, for example, a team, a particular team, or a group of organizations that are already carrying together a particular project, program, or have organized and implemented event or a series of events. That is the group of actors. They are key to the learning process because they are the ones that are going to promote the next steps of the learning process. They are going to promote the sharing of the results of the learning process. So they are key to the learning process under this approach. Next, please. We consider lessons learned and recommendation and as products of a learning process. And in the next slide, next, please, we have summarized the conception of learning as a product of individual and collective reflection on a concrete experience. So we have here the learning process with key inputs For us, the first key inputs of any learning process are questions. Questions that this particular group of people is interested in answer. You can pose those questions on at any moment during the development of the experience you would like to analyze. And those questions could be related to the activities, the results, the theory of change, the context, any component of the experience. The next step in this process is that a group of people had to take time to stop, reflect, analyze, and conclude, trying to answer those questions they posed at the beginning of the learning process. And the main inputs at this stage are memories, thoughts, and the documents produced by the people under this experience. And then you have lessons learned and reflections that could be turned into recommendations. And you also will have as outputs some editorial products to share and disseminate those lessons learned and recommendations. And you can also visualize the experience itself through those editorial products. So under this graphic, we emphasize lessons learned and recommendations as products of a learning process. Next, please. Let's talk a little bit about the value of learning. It has to do with the different levels of learning that we usually have in our institutions or organizations. These different levels of learning coexist in our institutions. They are not exclusive. They can coexist. Next. The first level of learning is the one that is called the single loop learning. Is the learning that is asking questions about how we do the things we do, how we implement our actions, how are we getting to our results. Is a first level of asking questions to our practice. And the conclusions that come from these learning processes at this level help to improve our practice. They help to improve the way we do the things we are doing. Under this first level of learning, we are not reviewing the fundamental things of our management, program management cycle. We are just adjusting the way we do things. Next, please. The second level of learning goes deeper. It makes questions about our goals. Have we defined the right goals? Are we using the proper measures for our activities, for our work? Are our strategies effective? Are we incorporating learning into our organization? This goes deeper. This is not only asking about how we are doing the activities we are implementing. This goes a step beyond. So the conclusions that we extract from this kind of learning process help us to reformulate our goals, values, objectives, assumptions, and strategies. So the entire cycle of the program and the entire program cycle could be reformulated depending on the conclusions of this level of learning. Next, please. And the third level of learning that is very important to improve the learning culture of the organization is to respond to more deep questions about the political, strategic, including ethical questions about the organization's mission and context. Conclusions of this learning level could lead to transformation in policies and institutional, like the institutional process as a whole, depending on the context review. This learning impacts the entire program cycle, and it is usually the learning an organization should conduct when reviewing or formulating the strategic plan, for example. Next. The next slides, we are going to dedicate to guide you through the 4-step route of the learning process. We came to this 4-step route after many years of trying different methodologies and approaches to learning and trying to understand and analyze deeper our own processes in WF Colombia and with partners. And this was like the synthesis of many error and successes trials. And under this route, we have a first step that we call the setup and framing phase. That is the fundamental step, because there, as we are going to see soon, there you establish the main things that we are going to develop through your learning process. Is the fundamental phase. On phase 2, you just implement the methodology and the tools to respond to the things that you defined on the first phase. And then you have to write and discuss the results of phase 2, your findings. You discuss that with that key core of that key group of stakeholders that were participating since phase 1, that we were talking some slides ago, is the key group of people that is very interested in carrying out this learning process. You discuss the results of your learning process with that group of people, and when everybody has agreed on the results, has agreed on the lessons learned, the recommendations, and some other aspects that the learning process could have given you, then you can go to the phase 4, that is about sharing, communicating, and applying the lessons learned and the recommendation. It's about inspiring others with your own experience and building real knowledge. Those are the 4 steps, and during the next slides, we are going to see step by step the kind of tools and the questions you have to put there. Next, please. During phase 1, the framing phase, you have to define your guiding questions, the questions that are going to guide the learning process. So you have to ask things like, what are the key issues to be analyzed from this experience? This experience is so rich, and we have been here for so long doing this. So what are the key things we would like to highlight, we would like to analyze from our experience? During the framing phase, you also have to define other fundamental aspects of the learning process. For example, you will have to answer who should participate in the learning process. Apart from the most close team, are there any other stakeholders who should be on board of the exercises, the learning exercises, or is only our team, for example? What is the time frame that we are going to analyze? For example, we have been developing this experience for 20 years. Are we going to cover all the 20 years, or are we going to focus on the last 5 years, for example? During this step, you have to decide if you would like to share your results, that you should share your results even internally. You should share with any audience. So you should identify your target audiences, who those audiences are, what are the key messages you would like to communicate, how will you communicate those results to each audience, what are the media you are going to use, the procedures you are going to put in place to communicate and share your results with internal and external audiences. Those things you have to answer during this framing phase. It is very important to have someone from communications on board from the beginning. It's not nice to call someone from communication at the end to say, we would like to make a video, but we forgot to tell you that we were doing this learning process, so now you have to help us with some interview. No, avoid that. Please call someone from communications from the beginning of your learning process, from this framing phase. Ask them to help you to define those target audiences and the media and the challenges and the way you would like to communicate the things you think you need to communicate. And during this framing phase, you also define the methodology and the tools you would like to apply to answer the questions that you are defining here. So you would have to establish if you are going to conduct interviews or workshops, what kind of interviews, what kind of collective exercises or workshops. Those are the fundamental things that you will have to define under this first phase. Next. Here we have an example of the things that teams answer when they say, we have to focus on some aspects of our experience. What are the key issues that we would like to analyze? And here are some examples. Next, please. For example, teams used to focus on what has been done well, why has it worked, what has failed, and why. It is very important to learn from the failed activities or the things that have gone not as well as we were planning they should go. Some teams also ask about the objectives. Are the objectives relevant under a new or transformed context? Why are they still relevant? If we would like to replicate this experience with other teams or with our team, but in another geography, what should be avoided? What should be maintained? What could be our advice to those teams? Do we need to adjust our theory of change? How and why do we need to adjust it? Those are some of the examples that we obtain in this framing phase of the questions, the guiding questions we obtain in this framing phase. Next. When we have all the fundamental things for the learning process defined under the framing phase, then we are ready to start the implementation of the methodology and tools. So we start looking for answers. We start applying the tools we have defined on the previous phase. Next. And we would like to share with you some of the tools we use. We used basically two techniques, the interviews and the collective reflection. And we have developed and adjust some tools that have been implemented by others. Some of these are our own creation, but some of them are just we took tools that others have created. Under the individual interviews, we use two kinds of interviews, the semi-structured interviews, basic or in-depth interviews. Semi-structured because we use based on the guiding questions that we defined on the first step, the framing step. We structure some questions, but those questions are just to guide a conversation. So that's why we call them semi-structured interviews, because we do have like a questionnaire, a kind of questionnaire, but it's an open questionnaire. And we have structured interviews that are more closed questions, difficult to adjust, because if you adjust those questions, the objective of that kind of tool is lost. So that's the difference between the semi-structured interviews and the structured interviews we use. Regarding the collective reflection exercises or workshop, we have adopted and developed some exercises based on analogies. We have found that analogies are powerful tools because they allow you as a participant to take distance from the experience you have been participating, and that distance allow you to be more open in the way you share your thoughts, your memories, and you analyze the documents that exist in that experience. And the analogies are like the tree and the sowers. We are going to see a little bit deeper that tool. There is an analogy we call the river, that the river is the experience, and on that experience we put some canoes, and on the canoes we put the actors that have been participating, and we start to enrich the river with other kinds of images, and each one of those images represent an aspect of the experience that under the framing phase we have decided to analyze. The other analogy is the cooking pot. We are going to explain it later. And we have used other analogies as one table to analyze concrete experiences of collective, for example, platforms, discussion platforms, round tables. So we use tables to analyze the different aspects of that kind of dialogue platforms. We use house. The house is another analogy we use, and the parts of the house represent different aspects of the experience. And there is a very useful tool that has been, perhaps some of you already know and have been using it, is the 6 thinking hats. I recommend you to visit the De Bono group place. It's a very rich place for this particular tool, but for many other facilitating and quick evaluation tools. And we have a quick learning questionnaire that can be used individually or during the collective exercises. Those are the main tools we have been using. And now, next please. We would like to share just two of the interviews to give you an example, the kind of, for example, the quick learning questions that I was telling you that you can use individually or during the collective exercise. You start with the people asking what has worked well, what do they identify has worked well in terms of activities or strategies or communications or administrative aspects. It depends on the guiding questions that you defined during the framing phase. So you have to always bring those guiding questions to these tools. So what has worked well and why? What has failed and why? If that group of people, of that person could do something new or in a very different way to achieve the outcomes, what would that be? And we always finalize with a synthesis, even if we are doing an interview or if we are in a collective exercise, we always put at the end these questions, this question of asking for the main recommendations that you would give to your team or to other teams or to other organizations in order to start or implement a similar experience. What should they avoid? What should they do in order to achieve their outcomes? This is an interview that you can implement in some minutes, or you can stay there for an hour or so doing that, but it's really quick if you need to be very quick. USAID developed a very quick interview. They call it post-action review, PAR, that they recommend to apply this tool when you end a project or a very well-defined phase of a project. You can apply this post-action review. You ask people what should have happened, what actually happened, and if there is a gap or a difference between 1 and 2, then you ask why is that difference. Perhaps what actually happened surpassed the expectations at the beginning. So why? Or perhaps it was under implementation of the project. You should ask why. And they ask directly what was learned, and in the similar way we do with our quick learning questions, they ask for recommendations. Those are two examples, and in the documents we are going to give you the link at the end. You will find the other examples of basic and in-depth interviews we are using, so you can get inspirations from those other tools. Next, please. This part of the webinar, we would like to share with you two of the analogies we have been using. They have been proved very effective to conduct collective learning processes during phase 2. This is the tree and the sowers. Here, the experience is represented by the tree, and the key actors, the actors that have been implementing that experience, that have been participating in that experience, are the sowers. We start with the analogy putting the soil. The soil represents the background with positive and negative aspects that were there before the experience started. What were the enabling and the limiting conditions from the context or from the organizations or from the communities that were there before the activity started. So we collect those aspects in the form of nutrients if they were enabling conditions, or rocks if they were limiting conditions. And all the time we establish the connection with the analogies, with the analogy of the trees and the roots of the tree and the nutrients for the tree. Then we plant the seed. We put the seed on the soil. The seed contains the description of the experience, a very brief description. What is the name of the experience? What was the motivation to start with the experience? The time frame of the experience? The expected results of the experience. We plant the seed, and then we bring the sowers. The sowers are represented here by small figures, human figures, and in each one of those human figures, participants have to write the name and the role of the main actors that have been linked to the experience from the beginning. Then the tree starts to grow, and you draw the trunk and the branches of the tree, and on the branches you make the participants to write the milestones, those events, good or bad events, that have mark the difference between one road or the other in the experience, that have bring good things or bad things to the experience and their development. Then, as in nature, you have trees, you have leaves on the tree. Here, for the experience, we represent the activities and the strategies using cards in form of leaves. And if those activities or strategies have worked well, then those leaves are on the tree, in the above part of the tree. And if they have not worked well, then you put the leaves over the soil, because as in nature, when the fallen trees are used by bacteria and they are incorporated as nutrients to the soil, when you implement an experience, your failures, if you take advantage of your failures and you learn from your failures, you can nurture your experience. So we use that figure of the trees to collect the strategies and activities that have worked and have not worked, and why. Then we have fruits. We represent the achievements of the experience using fruits, and there is a reflection about how and why and when did the experience and the actors came with these achievements. Then we represent the innovations, the activities, the strategies, or any kind of innovation that the stakeholders of this experience have put into practice we represent those innovations using flowers and putting those in the trees. Some of the innovations have worked, some others couldn't work, but you put them on the tree, on the canopy of the tree. Then we use birds as a symbol of the impacts. Birds help us to disperse the seeds. So these fruits, these achievements are useful for whom and how. How can they be more than only achievements or outcomes? How can they be converted into impacts? If the experience is too young, perhaps you don't have impacts yet, but you could have some effects. So you use the birds to represent those impacts or effects of your experience. And we use butterflies and worms to represent the characteristics of good alliance and partners and bad alliances and partners. Using the worms representing things that make damage to your experience and you should avoid them in the future, that kind of alliances in the future. On the contrary, you should bring more pollinizers as butterflies that could help you to implement further, to bring further your experience. Next. In a very similar way, we have developed the other analogy. We recommend to use this analogy of the cooking pot for project level learning exercise. The tree and the sowers is good for project level or for long-term or medium-term experiences. But for project level, the cooking pot is good. And here we have the different parts of the exercise representing different aspects of the project. It depends on the questions you define during your framing phase. Next. After you have applied all your methodologies and tools, you have to analyze the answers you got, write the report and validate the lessons and the recommendations and other findings with the key actors, the same actors that participated in the framing phase should give a revision to this report. We used very simple reports. We establish the answers to the learning or guiding questions. We highlight lessons and recommendations, and we put in annexes all the other information that could complement this part. How to validate? It depends on your conditions, email, Skype calls, in-person meetings, if it is possible, or putting your report on Google Docs and receiving feedback. Next. Once all the key actors are happy with the results of the learning exercise, then you are on phase 4. You are ready to share. You have been producing your communication materials from the beginning. So this is time to finalize that production of your communication materials. And you share those materials with the target audiences, giving them the messages you defined you were going to deliver to those audiences. Remember that you defined these things from the beginning in the framing phase. And then it would be perfect if you can implement a little exercise to guarantee that the learning and the recommendations are applied. In other words, that the learning and the recommendations are incorporated into the program cycle by a group of people that you are interested for them to apply those lessons and recommendations. For this phase, in our case, in the Forest and Climate team, we have been using like very short study cases. We call them inspiring practices. They are very good to illustrate failures, challenges, successes, how context have had an impact on some practices, and to see the diverse things of experiences we have been implementing under the Forest and Climate team. We also have webinars and videos, and we have been implementing a short workshop with very particular teams that we call From Learning to Knowledge. That is a workshop, a short workshop, 3-hour workshop to help teams to apply those lessons and recommendations into their work plans. Next, please. To finalize this talk, we would like to share with you 2 lessons learned, and we would like to highlight the challenges you face, or at least the challenges we have been facing to promote and to implement these learning processes. One of the main challenges is time. People used to learn individually, but they don't take time to stop, reflect, and conclude collectively. And even though individual learning is valuable, collective thinking is powerful. So we try to encourage teams to take time to think and share collectively about what they have learned on their day-to-day work. And the other challenge is the actual application of lessons learned and recommendations. Even though we have this little workshop and we have defined a route to transit from learning to knowledge, applying the lessons learned and recommendations, we feel that we have a depth there. We have to close the gap between finalizing the learning process and applying the learning that comes from that learning process. And we wanted to emphasize that there are some enabling conditions for learning. We have found that interdisciplinary teams, clear lines of communication, a systemic thinking, and a pro-learning leaderships are key for teams to start incorporating learning processes into their team culture. That's everything I have for today. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Maria Fernanda. Perfect. So this brings us to the Q&A section of our webinar. And participants, this is your moment to send questions in about any of the exercises that Maria Fernanda reviewed, or about the learning process in general. I have a question or two that I can start us off with while you are all thinking. So the first one I wanted to ask you is, how much time do you need to go through the 4 steps route? I know you touched on it a little bit, but I think that, you know, given how time crunched I think all people in the conservation world are, it can be daunting to try to consider taking on another process. So can you just reiterate the time commitment that is required for this 4-step route?
Thank you, Emily. Very good question. Yes, thank you. The 4-step route can take from 30 minutes to 1 month. In our experience, you can go from a step 1 to a step 4 in a meeting. For example, you in a team meeting, you can say, let's ask something about our work, and then you can make a quick exercise to answer that question that you would like to discuss with your team, and then you can write the answers, the different answers to the question, and summarize the answers in some findings or recommendations or lessons learned, and then you can share that and think how can you apply that reflection. You can do that in 30 minutes, for example. But if you need and you have enough time, you can take a day or 2 or a week or a month. We have been implementing learning processes with different duration. It depends on the aim of the learning process. It depends on the disponibility of the teams, of the key actors involved.
Okay, sort of along those lines, I first wanted to thank you for mentioning to everyone that it's important to have communications involved from the beginning, because you and I work very closely together, which is always a fantastic experience. But I know communications for a lot of teams kind of gets tacked on at the end. So first of all, thank you for your plug. And I have one participant who's asking if you can give an example, perhaps, of a time where you were able to get a team or to help a team really apply an insight and change the practices, because that sometimes can be difficult, where we have our practices set up and we feel like we have to continue doing the same processes until, you know, we get to the end of the program or the grant cycle or what is it, or whatever context you're talking about. Do you have an example you can share with us along those lines?
Yes, of course. We have done, well, first of all, I would like to highlight that we learned that in phase 4, the sharing part of the 4-step route is not enough to share the documents or the report or the PowerPoint presentation, or even to have a meeting to present the results to the team. We learned that you have to organize a particular meeting or workshop to do the application part of this. And in order to do that, we have designed a short exercise. It's not with everybody involved in the learning process. You have to identify who are the key persons in the team or in the organization that could be take advantage of a certain set of recommendations or lessons, and invite that group of people to the applying exercise. We have done this with the WF Peru team as part of a workshop on learning processes. At the end of the workshop, each one of the participants had to do the quick applying exercise with themselves, and it was great to see how if you choose the right lesson to incorporate into your work plan, it can be very useful. And we have been doing that with part of our team here in WF Colombia, the team in Mocoa, in the Piedmont region, in the Amazon Piedmont region. We recently made a very quick applying exercise with the team that is conducting a particular experience. So we went with them through using the tree. We went with them identifying key aspects that they should incorporate in the design of an experience they are going to start. So this is not at the end, but at the beginning of the experience that we conducted this learning exercise, and some weeks later we made the applying exercise, giving them 3 key aspects to incorporate into the design of the methodological route they are going to follow with the experience in a watershed. And it was great to see how useful it was for them to incorporate these 3 key pieces into the design of their work.
Great. And sort of along those lines, I have 2 questions that I think are linked from 2 different participants. So the first is, both of them are indicating that there's a lot of interest in this. It seems like a very useful tool, but there's a little bit of hesitation because one person in particular is asking, these activities seem very valuable, but also kind of complex. So are these exercises, these reflection and learning exercises, normally facilitated by a knowledge learning expert? And the second related question is asking how can you best decide which one of these activities will sort of achieve the reflection and lessons collection results that will be best for your particular project?
Well, regarding the first question, I can tell you that once you have incorporated the general framework of the learning value and the need to incorporate learning as part of the organizational culture, you can apply any tool. You don't need an expert there, but it helps to have someone. It's not a knowledge management expert or a facilitator expert. It helps to have someone that could conduct the exercise just following the guidelines. For example, we have written this exercise down, and we have the experience of people from our team here in Colombia conducting the exercises by themselves. And that is great because they make the adjustments they need, and they create other analogies that are more useful for them, or they can manage better, because they capture like the essence of the analogy. The analogy is intended to create that distance that I mentioned before. So you don't need an expert to do this, but it's good to have someone in the team doing the facilitation, so the others can concentrate in writing and discussing and capturing their thoughts in the way the facilitator could guide. And regarding the other question, if I understood well, is how do you decide if a certain tool is better than other to answer the questions? The key group of factors, once they define the guiding questions during the framework, the framing phase, they have to decide if they should use an interview with some people that don't like going to workshop. Perhaps it's better to interview them. And with people that like the collective discussion, then you define that you are going to have workshops with these focal groups. So it's part of the design that you do at the beginning, thinking more in the kind of people you would like to invite to participate than in the answers that you need to find, because you can go to find the answers using any of the tools we have listed there and other tools that you can find in the web.
Okay, and I will say for participants that we are sending out a pretty substantial list of tools and resources for you to use in the email that comes after this webinar. So keep your eyes out for that. In addition to obviously the recording, we have one last question, and this one refers more partially to to being able to adapt these activities to take cultural considerations or context into account. So this one person is asking in particular, how can you, or is there an effect of cultural considerations, like when working with indigenous groups, or wanting to make sure that you have equal gender representation? Are there things you need to take in mind considering those issues when designing some of these learning exercises?
Yes, very good question, and the answer is the general advice is that you should adjust all the tools, not only to cultural, gender, or generational considerations, but also the time you have. All the things can determine how you adjust the tools. And we have applied, for example, the tree or the river or the house images, analogies, with indigenous people with low literacy capabilities, and you just emphasize the images, not the text, when you are using those tools. It depends on the interest and the capacities of the group you are working with.
That makes perfect sense. You want to make sure that you're asking the questions that the participants will be best situated to answer. So we've actually come to the end of our time today. Participants, several of you asked about additional information and assistance, and you're welcome to reply to the automated email that you'll get at the about an hour from the end of the webinar with additional questions, and I can connect you if necessary to Maria Fernanda for additional expert advice. But I want to thank you, Maria, for sharing your expertise with our community, and to thank all your participants for joining us and sending in your very thoughtful and engaging questions. And as I've mentioned, you'll receive your follow-up email in about an hour with a good, hefty list of additional resources of publications that are from our team, WWF Forest and Climate, publications from other organizations, and websites for you to really dive in and find more tools that work best for you. Next slide, please. So if you want to revisit this webinar or share it with colleagues, the recording will be up on our Forest and Climate YouTube channel probably by the end of the day. And you can also find recordings of previous sessions there about a wide variety of forest and climate and REDD+ topics for additional enrichment. Next slide, please. So thank you all again for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you.